All right, so my dad grew up in the mountains of West Virginia, and back when he was a young lad, maybe 12 or 13 years old, he went into the woods behind his house to go squirrel hunting with his two older brothers. So they were out there all day, and finally it got dark, and they had to head home because their parents would get worried if they weren't home by sundown. But they didn't see their father until later that night, after they had already eaten dinner. So they were all sitting in the living room, the three brothers, just eating Triscuits and drinking tea, waiting for their dad to come home, and they heard him pull into the driveway, but instead of parking in the driveway, which is what he always did, he parked in the garage. And this was weird because he never parked in the garage. The only time he ever parked in the garage was when he was carrying something big or heavy or dangerous, like freshly cut timber. Or once, when he brought home an entire roll of barbed wire, like a whole roll of it, just put it right in the garage and didn't say anything about it. My grandpa was a very quiet man. He didn't talk much at all, even in his own home. So then one of my dad's brothers, I forget which one, goes out to the garage to go check on him because he's been in there a while, and he's just sitting in the garage in the truck. And he says, "Dad, why are you in the garage? Why'd you park in the garage?" And his dad says, "You don't want to come out here." And then he turns off the lights and rolls up the garage door. And then my dad's brother opens the door, looks in there, and he sees a pair of headlights and a set of footprints in the mud. And the footprints were heading away from the house. Now, the thing is that when the sun goes down in these mountains, critters come out. There's snakes and raccoons and deer and grouse and all kinds of stuff. And every night, when my grandpa would come home from work, the boys would run out to greet him because he always brought them little trinkets. Like he brought home snakes and squirrels and raccoon hands, like he would bring home weird stuff. So they were used to seeing, a snake or a squirrel or whatever in the headlights. So when they saw the pair of headlights, they assumed it was just a deer or something. But then when they looked down and saw the footprints, that's when things got weird. These were not animal tracks. These were humanoid tracks, like clearly made by a human hand. So then my dad's brother goes running back into the house and tells my dad and the other brother, he's like, "Dude, you got to come see this. This is crazy." And then my dad, being the skeptic that he is, goes out and looks in the garage, and there's nothing there. The garage is empty. The truck is still there, but there's no sign of his father. And the garage door is open. So he goes outside, and he looks around, and he doesn't see anything either. It's too dark to see anything. But then he feels the tracks, and the tracks are big. They're huge. They're easily a size 14 or 15, like very big, hairy humanoid feet. So then they do what any reasonable people would do. They grab a shotgun and some flashlights, and they go walking in the woods behind their house to try to find their dad and follow the footprints. Now, their cabin, the way it's situated, it's kind of nestled in a valley between two hollers or two ravines, so it sits low. And then above them, on the hill behind their house, that's where they're going. They're following the footprints up the hill behind their house. And as they're walking through the trees, they're shining their flashlights around, looking for their dad, looking for whoever made those footprints, because there were no houses nearby. And they knew that nobody else was out in the woods that late at night. They knew it was just them and their dad. So then they start hearing noises in the trees, like heavy footsteps keeping pace with them, like somebody or something is following them. Now they couldn't see because it was so dark and the trees were so thick, but they could hear the footsteps. And then eventually those footsteps stopped, and they heard a loud crash in the trees, and then they heard a voice, a raspy, raspy voice that said, "Get away, get away, get away." And then they turned around, and they shined their flashlights around, but they couldn't see anything. And then they started hearing more crashes in the trees, and then they heard another voice. This one sounded like an old man's voice, and it said, it's okay, don't be afraid, it's okay." And then they heard a third voice, and this one sounded like a woman's voice, and it was kind of sing-songy, and it said, "Come walk with me, come walk with me, come walk with me." And then the old man's voice said, "No, let him go, leave him alone." So they just stood there for a moment listening to the voices in the trees, and then the voices stopped. So then they started walking again, and they started walking faster. And then the footsteps started following them again, and they started getting closer. And they were getting pretty scared at this point because they couldn't see anything. But they could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer. So then they ran. They started running as fast as they could through the trees, and they could hear the footsteps behind them, gaining on them, pounding the ground like thunder. And they knew whatever was out there was catching up to them. So then they started climbing up the hill, and they climbed up a little ways, and they found a hollow, like a little ravine that went down into the hillside. And they climbed down into the hollow and hid behind some rocks. And they were out of breath, and they sat there for a moment, and they could hear the footsteps behind them coming closer and closer. And then suddenly the footsteps stopped. So then they started hearing more voices in the trees, and they were whispering now, and the voices were getting closer and closer until they were right next to them, and they were shining their flashlights right in the boys' faces. And the boys screamed and started running again. They ran through the trees as fast as they could until they reached the road, and then they kept running until they got to our house. So when they finally got home, they told their mother what happened, and she called the sheriff. And the sheriff came and took their statement. And then he went out and followed the footprints, and he found a place where a fire had been burning, and it looked like somebody had made a campfire and then smashed it out. And the sheriff thought it was strange, but he couldn't really do anything about it. There was no evidence of foul play, and the boys didn't want to press charges. So the sheriff just chalked it up to some mountain men being stupid and left. But to this day, nobody knows what happened to their dad. And my dad believes that some Potbelly Goblin snatched him up and took him into the hills. So, what's a Potbelly Goblin, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. A Potbelly Goblin is a type of goblin that's said to inhabit the forests and caves of West Virginia. They're known for their short stature, their green skin, and their large potbellies, which they apparently fill with stolen goods. Potbelly goblins are also said to be very strong and very elusive, and they often attack travelers who wander into their territory. They typically attack at night, and their attacks are usually unprovoked. They will just stop you in the forest and eat your flesh. Sightings of pot-bellied goblins have been reported in many parts of West Virginia, and the creature has become a part of the state's folklore. However, despite the numerous reports, there is no concrete evidence that pot-bellied goblins actually exist. Some believe that the sightings may have been misidentifications of small people or even bears. Others believe that the stories were simply made up to scare people away from the wilderness. So was this a real pot-belly goblin attack, or just some miscreants playing a prank on the poor, unsuspecting wood-gatherers? I'll let you decide. But if you ask my dad, he'll tell you to this day that it was a pot-belly goblin. All right, folks, that was my encounter with a pot-belly goblin. If you enjoyed this story, please feel free to stick around and check out more of my content. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time.